B9 is for biodiversity with Rachel and Handy.
Let's start by presenting the B9 policy. The first read of it can be confusing, but there are a few words that are key for understanding the policy, and these are the words we will focus on in these short videos. In this video, we will ask, what are mitigation and compensation measures, and how do we know if they are acceptable according to B9? The mitigation hierarchy is a useful tool for impact management, including those that affect biodiversity. It uses a hierarchical approach that must be followed for every impact identified to ensure that they are reduced to a minimum. First, an impact should be avoided. If this isn't possible, it must be minimized. If it cannot be minimized completely, any damage must be restored as soon as possible. If at the end of these three stages there is still remaining impact, then, and only then, can compensation be considered. When we talk about compensation for biodiversity, we are not talking about giving plants and animals money. Well, not directly. But we are talking about compensating an impact by protecting or restoring another area or population that is equivalent to what will be lost. So, how do we avoid impacts? The easiest way to think of this is by changing the project's footprint in space and time. We can avoid impact by avoiding the use of greenfield sites, and in particular areas of critical importance for biodiversity. Within a project site, we can avoid impact by working around any important features, by avoiding fragmentation of surrounding habitat, even if the project is being constructed on a brownfield site, and by being sensitive about construction and operation times. An example of avoiding a greenfield site comes from a gas pipeline planned to pass through a protected area. By analysing alternatives, it was finally decided to avoid the area and go round the edge instead, even if it was more difficult to construct, as it would avoid any conflict. Another example comes from a proposed mine in Argentina, whose location would have impacted a migratory corridor for guanacos. As guanacos only move through the site twice a year, the plan was to make sure that mine construction and operation schedule took this into account. The second step of the mitigation hierarchy is minimization. The idea here is to minimize impacts, and there are lots of ways to do this. Minimizing noise and light pollution, minimizing the project footprint, minimizing habitat fragmentation and changes in river flows, minimizing wildlife mortality and barriers in road projects, and minimizing chemical pollution. And there are lots of really inventive methods to minimize impacts. The key is to do it well, and be prepared to modify the approach based on data from monitoring. Next, restoration. Once the construction phase or the project is over, we need to put everything back in a state as good as, or better, than we found it. A really impressive example of this is the LNG pipeline in Peru, which was built without roads, and the strip cleared for the pipeline was restored using native species. An extensive monitoring program shows how the vegetation has recovered so that the pipeline's route is hardly visible anymore. Compensation is the last step of the mitigation hierarchy, and perhaps the most complicated and controversial. In English, we use the words compensation and offsetting interchangeably. Compensation action usually comprises the restoration or protection of a new area or the strengthening of an existing protected area. There has been a lot of criticism about the use of compensation as a license to trash, allowing a project of high impact to take place in a protected area because it will pay for the protection of a new area. It isn't, and we have to be very careful about how we explain any compensatory action to avoid this type of criticism. We do this by following some international guidelines that IDB has adopted and adapted. Our policy is very clear that compensation cannot be used if a project causes significant conversion of critical natural habitat. This is non-negotiable, and if you see there might be a problem like this, you should bring it up as early as possible with the project team, as IDB cannot fund it. We must also show that impacts have been avoided and minimized before compensation is considered. We must not compensate for impacts that we can mitigate in other ways. We cannot look at a project impact and immediately jump to the idea of compensation. We are compensating for the residual impact, the impact that remains after we have gone through all other phases of the mitigation hierarchy. If we do need to compensate, we need to think about actions that result in no net loss to biodiversity, or do something even better for biodiversity. So, if you destroy 10 hectares of forest, restore at least 10, and ideally 20. We must also think about how the compensation actions benefit species and habitats on a landscape level, not just at the project level. For instance, a rare species may benefit more from a conservation strategy for the whole species rather than just protecting a small subpopulation. It is also important that any compensation is additional to current conservation projects in the area and does not replace them. For example, if the government is providing $60,000 for the management of a protected area, the compensation action cannot replace this either in funding or in action. However, if the protected area actually needs $600,000 to be managed effectively, then as long as the government pledges to keep funding to the current level, the project compensation could meet this cost deficit. The habitat or species that is to be protected or restored has to be as similar as possible to that being destroyed. You can't modify a lake and protect a forest. You need to find a similar lake to protect. In addition, any compensatory action must last as long as, or ideally longer, than the impacts at the project site, and action must be implemented before these impacts occur. If you destroy a pond for a duck and don't create a new pond for a year, what is going to happen to the duck in the meantime? Finally, compensatory measures chosen must be acceptable to the stakeholders worried about the project, and most importantly, the measures must be possible to implement on the ground. Even though this sounds obvious, I say this because the field of compensation has become very academic and data hungry, with biologists developing hugely complex plans, metrics and monitoring to ensure that everything is compensated precisely, but with the practicality of implementing these measures taking second place. We must be pragmatic about this and look for solutions that have been shown to work in the country the project is taking place in. The approach of IDB to compensation is very different from that of IFC, which requires a quantitative approach to decide whether or not the offset is sufficient. IDB doesn't require this. We just require that our experts are convinced that the compensatory action is sufficient. So, let's imagine we are reviewing a biodiversity compensation plan. How do we know if the measures are acceptable? First, they need to comply with national legislation, and an increasing number of countries have legislation specifically on this theme. Second, we need to have evidence that the compensation plan has been developed after all other stages in the mitigation hierarchy have been addressed. And third, it must follow IDB's offsetting rules that we have just discussed. But please remember the bottom line: if the residual impact is significant and the project is located in critical natural habitat, IDB cannot fund the project. In all other cases, we can consider the option of compensation. And it is ESG that makes the judgment call, both on the gravity of the impacts and whether or not the mitigation measures are acceptable. A good example of a well thought out mitigation plan comes from the ethylenoplastics plant in Mexico. During preliminary surveys at the project site, 348 adults of a very rare endemic cycad were found, as well as 135 hectares of dry forest, which is down to 3% of its original cover in the region. Cycads have been around since the time of the dinosaurs, and most of them are highly threatened. This species is considered critically endangered. Thus, according to our policy, if the project residual impact were to be significant, the project could not receive funding from the IDB. Once the presence of this species was discovered, a wide survey was undertaken to determine the species status. This had never been done before. And it was discovered that although rare, the species was not as threatened as was previously believed, and that destruction of this site would not cause species extinction. So, what were the mitigation actions? They avoided 30 hectares of dry forest on the site, and transplanted all of the cycads, bought a neighbouring 114-hectare farm and restored it, and germinated cycads from seeds collected on the site. 1,199 cycads have been produced and planted in the offset area and in the on-site set-asides, and both areas have formally been gazetted as nature reserves. However, there was a time lag. The dry forest was destroyed before the offset had been restored, and the area restored was equal to that destroyed, so there was no net gain for biodiversity. But given the pressure on land, we felt that this had been an effective offset and has resulted in much better protection in the long term for both the cycad and dry forest than there was before the project began.